librarian here at Acton Memorial Library, and I'm so excited about this program tonight from Faith and Folklore from the Museum of Russian Icons, presented by Laura. I've heard wonderful things about this museum. Before we get started, I just want to share a couple things. I'm going to put a link here in the chat to our calendar, which probably everyone who's here has already been at before since they registered, and the sign up for our newsletter, which I highly encourage you to sign up for. I'm the person who does it, and typically there's one a month, and it kind of has all the good stuff that's coming up for the month, just all organized together, and some other library news. And then the link for the Adult Services Department email. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat. I also want to mention a couple of programs that are coming up. On the 19th, we have a craft night. I think that is full, but they're very popular, and I'll have more coming up in the calendar. On the 26th, we have our final discussion in our Acton Movie Night series, and it's about a documentary called Last Train Home that you can watch on Canopy. If you have any questions about that, please reach out. I'm really excited about this particular discussion. The film looks really fascinating. And then on February 2nd, we have another painting program. This one is in celebration of Lunar New Year. And it's going to be watercolor of a tiger, because 2022 is the year of the tiger. And then on the 4th, there's a cooking program where we're going to be making chapchae, which is a Korean dish, if you don't know, with noodles and vegetables, and it's actually a cook-along program. So if you sign up for that, you can get the ingredients, and the person who's running the program will take you through the cooking process step by step. And then on February the 9th, we have another cooking program. This one is kind of in anticipation of Valentine's Day, and it's called Passionate Dishes for Your Partner. So you can make them for your partner or for yourself, but it's going to be a cooking program where you learn some neat tips and tricks for passion in the kitchen. And there's more stuff on the calendar, but that's a couple weeks out, so I'll leave it there. During this program, I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions for Laura, please feel free to share them there. Thank you. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, hello, my name is Laura Garrity-Arquitt. Thank you so much for having me. I'm from the Museum of Russian Icons in Clinton, Massachusetts, and I will be talking about faith and folklore in Russian culture. If you have any questions at all, feel free to ask, in the chat at any point. I'll stop a few times and check in and see if anybody has anything. I'm very happy to answer as I go. So just a little bit about us. We were founded by a man named Gordon Langton, who started collecting icons as he developed his plastics factory. He built factories all over the world, including one in Russia. And you can see a display of the icons in his home. After about 15 years, he had well over 100 icons hanging in every room of his house. And it was his wife who suggested that he find a better place for them. And so he, after some discussion, decided to build a museum. He had just sold his factory to his employees, and he thought this would be a terrific way to give back to a community that had supported him. And so he purchased an old rundown mill building right near his factory in downtown Clinton. You can see in the upper left picture there, that's Dnipro, which is still in action today. They're now under the name J-Bill, and they're the largest employer in town. But he bought the rundown mill building right along Central Park and refurbished it. Here's a look at what it looked like in 1850. Incidentally, this was office space for the Bigelow brothers, Erastus and Horatio Bigelow, who made carpets in town in the same factory that Gordon made plastics. The building was completely renovated, and historical photos and documents were used to restore as much of the history of the building as possible. It was very important to Gordon that the town be celebrated, both its past and its future. He expanded the building a second time, so he opened it in 2006. He expanded it a second time in 2008, and then another time in 2010, giving us several large galleries, an outdoor terrace, and a large auditorium. You can see the inside, while the outside reflects the history, the inside is completely modern, as a way to really, I think, play around with Gordon's idea of a green museum, a museum that, you know, would be environmentally conscious, and so all of the lights are LED, and all of the building materials and the practices that we follow each day are in that mindset. There's our main gallery where most of the icons are stored. And now I'm going to get to my talk. So faith in folklore really begins with this idea of humanity communicating to each other through picture, which is something that we have done as far back as can be traced. What's incredible is we can look at this painting, this cave painting, which is, you know, 5,000 to 2000 BCE. And even though the culture that made this is long gone, and even though the people who would have utilized this image, the people it was made for, are completely alien to us, we can look at this picture and know what we're seeing. We can see somebody who's very athletic. We can see the stripes on the legs indicating muscle tone. We can see his broad shoulders. We can see his pose, which is very, very strong, very objective. And we can see that he's holding an instrument. Now he's holding a bow, and it's, I think, very clear to anybody who's seen any bow and arrow, this is the basic bow shape. And so we know we're looking at a hunter, we're looking at an archer. And it's an incredible thing that we can understand what we're seeing, you know, outside of time and outside of really context. Now, of course, this language developed throughout cultures. One of the most recognizable visual languages, of course, would be in Egypt. When you think of the murals of Egypt. But I want to point out a couple of things here that are going to come up. One, we're looking at hunters. And we know that, because very smart people have told us so, but also because we've just seen a warrior, we've just seen a hunter. They have that same strong pose, and they have those same broad shoulders, and they're holding instruments. Now, these ones are much less recognizable than a bow, but we can see in the background that the birds are being hunted. And so we understand that this is another tool for hunting. I want to point out that these same figures being shown multiple times, and there are multiple scenes taking place in this one frame, but that one can start to pick apart, looking at the largest images and following this narrative and start to take in the message of this picture. And that's something that developed over time in every culture. And of course, the images change, the colors change, and the messages change. Here's a very different type of image. And this is the precursor to the Russian icon, or to the Byzantine icon, the Orthodox icon. This is what's called a Fayum portrait. It comes from the region of Fayum in Roman Egypt, and it's a mummy portrait. So this would have been done, and it would have been placed in someone's mummy wrappings inside the casket. It tells a lot about the person, because the idea of the mummy portrait was to capture the essence of the person, to tell about who they were. And we can tell a little bit about this man, again, even thousands of years into the future. We can look at him and we can understand, that he is a man of wealth, mostly because he could afford to have a funeral portrait made, but also by looking at his clothing. He's wearing a toga with purple sash, which gives him rank. But we also have an idea, excuse me, maybe about how he died. If you look at his left side of his face, it is malformed. And this is not deterioration of the painting, but is something that was on his person. This is original to the painting. And so we think he had some sort of growth or some kind of cancer, and that's how he died. Now, on to something much more recognizable to us today and in Christendom is the paintings of the catacombs. And so early Christians, the very first Christians, did not use imagery much because being from the Jewish religion, imagery is not used as part of liturgical purposes. And the original catacomb paintings didn't have any liturgical use to them, but were rather to teach. And they were used primarily to help more Roman and other non-Jewish cultures come into the religion, because they were coming into it from a completely different standpoint, and from standpoints that relied very heavily on imagery. And so this is the story of the Good Shepherd. And I want to point out the very different build. He doesn't have that really strong stance. He has a very easygoing stance. He's much thinner. He's not so broad in the shoulder. This is somebody, somebody kind. This is somebody, doing good deeds. So this is the Good Shepherd. You can see that sheep around his neck, harking back to the story about the Good Shepherd who goes off in search of the one sheep, leaving the other 99 in the field. Now, we have a bit of a gap between the catacomb paintings and the earliest known icons. And the reason for this is periods of iconoclasm, periods in the Byzantine Empire where icons were banned, the practice of painting and using them were banned, and existing icons were destroyed. There are a number of icons that predate the iconoclasm, which was 7th and 8th centuries, in St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. The reason St. Catherine's Monastery was exempt is because they were outside of Byzantine control, and they were also protected from the Arabic governments whose control they were under, with a writ of protection from the Prophet Muhammad. By tradition, they sheltered Muhammad when he was in exile, and he left them with a seal or a writ of protection, and they have it supposedly to this day. But importantly, the icons were protected. And here we have an image of Christ the Pentacreator. Now this is made in a similar technique to that mummy portrait with a wax paint. But I want to point out that it's not simply a painting of Jesus, but is a story about who Jesus is. First, you might notice that there are two separate facial expressions. One is full with a high eyebrow. The other is very angular with hollow cheeks, and the eye is a little bit lower. That's meant to show the duality of Christ, his humanity, his divinity, this idea of eternal judgment versus forgiveness. If you take a look at his hand, it's raised in a benediction or a blessing, and he actually spells out his initials in Greek, ICXC, with his hands. With the other, he holds a book, gilt and encrusted with jewels, as a way to symbolize the gospel. And so it also symbolizes him as the word. So there's a lot worked into this image. Before I move on, I just want to check, are there any questions? So if you have any, just pop them right in the chat.
No questions in the chat yet.
Okay, great. So Christianity worked its way into every aspect of life throughout the Roman and Byzantine empires. This is a rain guard. It's part of a horse team's accoutrement. They probably would have had a set of four, one for each of the four evangelists. This is the bull, which is a symbol for one of them, and then a cross at the bottom. And I also want to point out the concentric circles because this is very much utilized in Byzantine Christian art, this idea of circles within circles. Here's a cross pendant. This is also from Byzantium. And there again, we have those concentric circles. We also have grape designs. Now the grapes represent the wine, and which in Orthodox Christianity, as with many Christian denominations, represents the blood of Christ and the Eucharist. And this one is quite small. It's about 1/2 inch tall, but it would have been a daily cross that somebody would have worn, kept with them as a reminder of their faith. I want to talk a little bit about how Christianity came to Russia. Now, prior to the 10th century, Russia followed a pluralism that was very similar to those found in Nordic regions. There was a god of thunder and fire who helped bring in the harvest. There were different gods for different elements. There was Morozko, or Dead Moroz, who was the god of winter. There was a goddess of springtime. And Kievan Rus was really, at that time, not Russia as we know it, a huge, massive country, but was instead kind of an assortment of princedoms that often went to war with each other, battling over borders. It was Olga who first brought Christianity to Kievan Rus, and she did so from a necessity. Now, her story, there are two stories that I'm going to tell you. One, I want to point out how very severe looking her face is. And that harkens to her kind of popularized story. And so it was that St. Olga was widowed, her husband assassinated by a rival prince who sent messages offering his hand in marriage to Olga as a way to protect her. So he's slain her husband and now he's offering to marry her. It said that when his message arrived, it arrived with several of the wise men. And so she sent them back and said, send me all of your wisest men and all of your great politicians, and we will come up with a marriage pact. And so they came, and when they arrived, she said, let me do you an honor and have you carried into the city in your boat, which was kind of an ancient practice of the boat being taken from the river and carried up into the city. And as they were being taken into the city, she had them thrown into a ditch she had prepared, and they were buried alive. Then she sent messages that he was to send his strongest warriors to escort her to his city, and they would be married. And when they arrived, she said, oh, you must be weary from your journey. Please make use of my bathhouse. Once they were in, she locked them inside and burned the entire building down. It was then that she traveled with her armies and laid siege to the rival city, utterly decimating their population. And when they surrendered, she asked for each family to give one dove as they were able. And it said that she had her soldiers tie sulfur to the dove's feet and then send them back alit. And so the entire city burned to the ground. Any who survived were taken as slaves. And she went back, this great conqueror queen. It's kind of a vicious tale, and it puts her in a very dark light. Most historians today don't stand by that tale, as popular as it may be, and see it more as defamation of a very strong female leader. The real story is much less exciting. Olga, seeing her husband assassinated, seeing herself in a very dangerous plight. Princes would have wanted to marry her, to take her kingdom from her and from her son. She wanted to secure the kingdom. And what she did was she made alliances with the Byzantine emperor, arranged several marriages, and offered her troops in support of his to protect from Muslim and Arabic armies who were coming in and attacking Byzantium at the time. She, in opening these trade routes and as part of her marriage pact, she converted to Christianity. She tried to get her son to convert. He was not interested, but her grandson was. And so Prince Vladimir the Great, grandson to Olga, made further pacts and deals with the Byzantine Empire, expanded his princedom to cover all of Kiev and Rus, uniting kind of a country, and converted everybody to Christianity. Here's Vladimir and his grandmother holding a cross, and this is a contemporary pendant that could be worn to kind of remember those who brought Christianity to Russia. And I just want to point out, she's wearing very regal robes and has a crown showing her status. He also has the robes and the crown, but is holding a sword to show him as a great warrior as well as a prince. So now I'm going to talk about some saints. This is Saint Paraskeva, who's very popular in Russia. She was a Roman martyr. She's a great martyr. A great martyr is somebody who suffered greatly for their faith, somebody who withstood great torment, turned down great bribes. There are lots of these stories, being boiled in oil, being placed on a wheel, all of which they survive until their eventual beheading. But a great martyr is someone to look up to, somebody whose faith and conviction is admirable. And that's what a saint is. A saint is a role model, somebody whose life is one that you can follow. We know she's a great martyr by looking at this icon because a crown is being placed on her head. A great martyr is somebody who's going to be extra glorified in heaven. She holds a simple cross, and this in Orthodox Christianity is a symbol of a martyr, different than Catholic imagery where you find them holding the instruments of their torture. Her scarf is pure white, which symbolizes her purity. Her cloak is red, bright red symbolizes blood and martyrdom, and she wears a blue dress, and blue is heavenliness or holiness. It's another very popular saint. This is Saint George and the Dragon. Saint George was another Roman martyr. He's also a great martyr. Unfortunately, his crown has been worn away. It would have been made of gold leaf. The reason why the background of this icon is so white is because it was entirely covered in gold leaf, and over the centuries that has worn away. But he sits astride a white horse. Now, a white horse really it's universal in European art, harkening back to the Roman times, stands for victory. Roman armies who were victorious would come back to Rome and parade on white horses. So Saint George is having a victory. And who is the victory over but this dragon that he is slaying? The dragon symbolizes different things depending on the iconographer. It can symbolize worldly sin. It can symbolize pride. For instance, if the spear is going through the mouth. In this instance, the spear is going through the eye of the dragon, which is often done to symbolize a victory over passion or carnal sins. Saint George, like Paraskeva, took an oath of purity, of chastity. His cloak is also bright red, but very different from Paraskeva's is it's blowing in the wind. It's got this great sense of movement. It's a Russian icon, but it's very much in the Byzantine style. And Byzantine icons always sought to capture a sense of great movements and great importance in their icons while maintaining this very still feeling, allowing the viewer to sit with and contemplate the image. Here is another icon of St. George. This time the dragon is being pierced through the heart, which might be a victory over a different type of passion, a passion of being too worldly connected, too connected to relationships, too connected to one's life, and not so focused on the holy. The actual story of George and the Dragon is just out of a fairy tale. He rides into a town besieged by a dragon. The princess was set to be sacrificed to the dragon to save the town. He slayed the dragon, saved the princess, and converted the whole population to Christianity. This piece is about 2 inches tall, and it has a beautiful silver filigree cover with enamel that's melted glass with ground minerals and then precious gems. This was probably made for a military general or a high-ranking officer, perhaps from a very wealthy family. And he probably would have worn it or kept it in his pocket as a way to remind him of his faith, of his duty to kind of to God and country, but also as a way to bring protection to him. Now, this icon of George would have been made for a very different person, probably also somebody in the military, St. George being the patron saint of soldiers, but this is made of bronze. And these could be mass produced in a small workshop. They were very easy to set up if you have the mold, or you can make a mold. And so they were very affordable. And so this you would find on your average foot soldier. Now, interestingly, in both World War I and World War II, European soldiers coming across fallen Russian soldiers would find icons like this and others around their neck, and were noting it because it was so strange to find so many soldiers with religious imagery on their person. Are there any questions before I move on?
Nope.
Great. So I've shown kind of portrait icons of a single person, but I want to point out, similar to that Egyptian painting we saw, Russians developed a real knack for telling a large and complex story within a single frame. This is the presentation of the Virgin Mary into the temple. Now, Mary was dedicated to the temple by her elderly parents, and at a very young age, she was sent to live there and work there. There was a guild of young women who would perform kind of the household tasks. They would cook, clean, mend clothing. And while Mary was there, according to tradition, re-sew the cloth that hung between the temple and the holy space, the inner temple. Mary is shown as a small child at the bottom of the steps there, and she's talking with Zechariah. Behind her are her parents, Anna and Joachim, and behind him is a group of young women. And so those are the young women who lived and served in the temple. According to the story, the young child came right in and started walking right up the steps, and the priest was amazed at how unafraid she was. Now, Zechariah, incidentally, is the father of John the Baptist, and so it all ties together. I want to point out the architecture in the background because it's very modern looking. It looks almost Art Nouveau. And the reason for that is the Byzantine artists and then the Russian artists, rather than trying to use perspective that you saw throughout Europe, true perspective with the vanishing point being at the back of the painting, so it looks like you're looking right into something. They use what's called a false perspective, wherein no rules were followed as to how big or small things are, with the exception that the most important subject matter was largest. You can see both the tops and the sides of the stairs, and you can see the tops and the sides of the buildings. So you're seeing multiple parts of a building all in one frame. There was a sense of honesty about it, a sense of transparency, of trying to be as open and clear as possible. But also by abandoning traditional perspective, they were able to show multiple parts of the story. At the bottom, you have Mary greeting Zechariah. At the top, you have an angel greeting Mary, and kind of giving this idea of the Annunciation, which comes later, where she's told she'll bear the Christ child. Another popular saint who's just kind of had his day is Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus in the West. And he was a 4th century bishop and is known as a great defender of the faith. He spoke at the First Council of Nicaea, where it said he defended Christianity as we know it against what is now called a heresy, the Arian movement, which held that Christ was human and then divine, which caused quite a stir in the first few centuries. He's holding a sword in a church to show him as a defender of the faith, but also to tell a story of Saint Nicholas as a protector of a very specific city. So the city of Mozhaisk in Russia was one that was often attacked, being along an important trade route. It was often attacked and conquered. And when a church was built, an icon of St. Nicholas was used to dedicate the church, and the church was St. Nicholas. And when the city was next attacked, the St. Nicholas icon came out to the city walls, and they were victorious in fighting off the attacking army. And so this happened again and again. And people began to tell stories of an image of Nicholas standing over the town, holding a sword and protecting them. And so the church represents the city of Mozhaisk and shows him as a defender of people. Here's an icon of Nicholas that's called hagiographical. So this is another storytelling method that you find in icons. It's very much like a graphic novel or comic book, with each square telling a different aspect of the story. They're read left to right and top to bottom. And this one begins with the birth of Nicholas, goes through his childhood, acts while he was alive, and things that miraculous happenings while he died. Nicholas always has a very high forehead. The high forehead denotes great wisdom, shows what a great leader he was. He wears decorative robes. These are bishop's robes, which show his rank. He gives a blessing, a benediction, just like in Christ icons that we saw. And he holds a gospel book. And this again shows his rank. And here's an icon from a hagiographical set of Nicholas icons. And this shows Nicholas returning a kidnapped boy to his village. So this is a miracle that took place after his death. And this one, you can see the whole village who had been praying for the safe return of this boy runs out to greet him. And you can even see the boy's dog is straining at the leash to get to him. And again, for those who couldn't afford to commission large icons for their home, or the very fancy pictorial icons, could definitely afford these bronze icons. And even though this one is worn down by time and was not terribly detailed to begin with, we know right away that we're looking at Nicholas. We can see the bishop's robes, we can see the round head and how the hairline stops very high up. You can see his round beard, and we can see he's holding that sword and the church. Here's another hagiographical icon. This tells the story of Mary. Very different from the other one I showed you. This one has, rather than a central scene, it just has 4 scenes from her life. Mary is a saint who went to the desert and lived there till her clothing fell away, and became known as a great ascetic, somebody who did without. Very different from a martyr or a church leader whose lives I think are very easy to understand. These ascetics who live lives of withdrawal from society, hermits, for instance. They're very similar to Eastern traditions, where you find people performing these great feats as these great spiritual feats as a way of self-betterment. And to further Russia's incredible storytelling, they developed a wonderful way of miniature painting, sometimes using a single hair on their paintbrush. This is a calendar icon. It would have been a set of 12. 2 are lost to history. We have 10 in our collection, and they have selected saints from the liturgical year. So each saint is celebrated on a specific date. Each day in the Orthodox Church can celebrate as many, even more than a dozen different saints or feasts. Whoever commissioned the set, whoever paid the artist to create it, would have selected the saints for each day, or at least consulted them for the saints of each day. Now, what's interesting about this one is that it includes a very special type of saint called a passion bearer. A passion bearer is not a person who led a particularly Christian life. It's not a person who did without. It's not a person who was a great spiritual leader. And it's not a person who is martyred for their faith. It is a person who died in a Christ-like manner. So somebody who was murdered, maybe in a particularly vicious way, and didn't fight back, so kind of accepted their death. The Russians tend to use this designation as a political gesture. And the figure we're looking at is Saint Dmitry of Ooglitch. He is the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible. And he, depending on the historian you're speaking to, he either had a seizure and fell on his knife as a young boy, he was 8, or was assassinated by agents of his half-brother and his half-brother's wife. Now you can tell, I'm sure, that whoever commissioned this set was a believer that Dmitry of Ooglitch was assassinated. And so you can see there he is being assassinated. His soul is leaving his body, and an angel is coming down to bring him up to heaven, where the Mother of God and Christ child are waiting to greet him. I want to point out the gentleman behind him, the assassin. He's wearing a very funny looking hat. It's a white hat with a red decoration on top. In Russian iconography, this is used to symbolize a Jewish person. And so the anti-Semitism of Russia is absolutely speaking out in this icon, because in none of the historical records is the assassin described in any way.
Laura, I have a question.
Yes.
Forgive me if you already talked through some of this and I missed it. But you said that this might have been painted with a brush as thin as just one bristle. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
So that's amazing. What is the scale of this work?
Oh, yes, that's what I forgot to say. So this piece is 10 inches high, and the highlighted version there is 1 inch high and 1.5 inch wide.
Oh my goodness.
So it is very, very small.
Did you say this is like a calendar or a stuff?
Yep, so this is a calendar. This is the month of May, And this would be brought out, they would bring out each month. It's actually double-sided. If you're ever able to make it to the museum, it's absolutely a sight to see. And so it could be brought out and placed in a special holder so that you could see the saints of those days and pray with them and kind of ponder their stories.
Amazing. And then I have another question.
Mhm.
It looks like the soul is the small, pale, like naked looking figure, right?
Yes.
Is the soul like meant to appear like a baby?
So
To
that's
that
a really good question. So yes, the soul is very infant looking. It is very small. It is naked. You do sometimes find souls are swaddled. This is unique. I've never seen a soul look quite like this, where it's kind of actively moving to be greeted by the angel. And I'm not sure why the artist chose to do it, but I think that was probably an artistic choice.
And I have one more. Sorry, this piece is just very fascinating. So this is a calendar, features saints. And I'm sorry if I missed this, but would this be in someone's home or in a church, or where would it seems very fancy. Where would this be located?
So this one is absolutely exquisite. I'm not sure if you can tell very well from the photo, but the entire board is laid with gold leaf before the paint is applied. That allows the artist to scratch away paint and let the gold shine through to give it even more depth. So this was probably in a private chapel in a very wealthy area. I don't know that it would have been for private use, but it certainly would have been in a it would have been for private use, but I don't think in somebody's home, if that makes sense. We don't have any documentation on if it was in a palace. We like to imagine that it was made we think it might have been made in the Stroganoff school, and so we like to imagine that it was made for use by the Stroganoff family, but unfortunately we don't have that kind of documentation. But this could have been in a church or a private chapel.
Thank you.
Leaving the world of icons, so Nicholas II and his family were given that same designation of passion bearers a couple decades after their deaths. But a crash course on turn of the century Russian history, Nicholas II was not the very best of emperors, and Russia was in a horrible plight. People had been starving for decades. They had been languishing in poverty, poor education, especially in rural areas, and not a lot of thought given to protecting the Russian people. Most policies were geared toward the elite, the noble families. And when the revolution happened, the anger, not just towards noble families, but also the church that had supported these policies, it was enormous. And it's for that reason that religion was not outright outlawed, but very much pushed to the wayside. Over the next 30 years, some 90% of Orthodox property was seized, or church property, I should say, because it wasn't just Orthodox. The resources were meant to be returned to the people, and by and large, they were. Churches were taken apart by brick, with bricks being used to shore up old houses and public buildings. Many churches were turned into public buildings or demolished to make way for city pools. Museums of atheism were formed. These museums sought to teach about the evils of superstitious religions, because you know that phrase, religion is the opiate of the masses. Religion had been used as a political ploy to keep people down. Now, iconography, while it wasn't outright banned, you certainly couldn't make a living as an iconographer any longer. Now, certain towns, certain villages were very much reliant on this trade of religious art. One of them was Sergiev Posad, which is home to one of Russia's largest monasteries. That monastery supported itself by producing toys. The surrounding village also started opening up many toy shops. And that became this area's trade center. And they produced one of the quintessential Russian souvenirs, the nesting doll, or the Matryoshka doll. These were invented in 1890, and I have a wonderful talk I give on their history. But they were invented around the time of Russia's arts and crafts movement. Similar to the revolution, the arts and crafts movement was looking not to the bourgeoisie, not to the noble classes, but to the Russian people, and celebrating them and their culture. And that is why the Matryoshka doll, whose name comes from the popular name Matrona, which means mother, feature your typical Russian woman wearing a decorative apron, a beautiful babushka, a scarf that women would hand embroider through their youth, and they would wear them certain ways on whether they were married or not. The Soviet government really picked up on the ability of these dolls to produce income, not just to support the regions, to support the country as a whole. They were very popular as a tourist trinket and as an export. And so factories were opened in several areas, and the dolls made in these factories were meant to represent each different area, and so they do differ. Now in Palek, Huli, and Mistra, 3 painting villages, they had for many generations produced 3 very specific sets of icons. Palek icons were very artistic. Mistra were also artistic, but had a very reverent quality to them. And Huli produced icons that were similar to the itinerant painters that you find, the ones called American primitives. They would travel and paint very affordable icons. If you were born in one of these villages, you would have been trained to be an artist, regardless of gender. You were an iconographer. That was your life. Your children would be iconographers and your children's children's. When this was no longer a viable option, it became desperately important to find a new trade. One artist left Palek. He traveled to Fedoskino, where they had a workshop making beautiful paper mache boxes. He learned the trade, brought it back, and opened up a guild in Palek, helped open guilds in Huli and Mistra, where they produced beautiful lacquered boxes. These are made by forming the paper mache around a mold, creating the box, and then painting the box with actually the same materials and techniques as the icons. Egg tempera paint, this idea of again, visual storytelling, and miniature painting, of course. Now this box that you're looking at is about 1/2 inch tall. It's very, very small, but the detail is exquisite. And again, the tiniest brush would have a single hair. This one celebrates Russian winter, Russian culture. The couple there is riding what's called a troika. That's a sleigh pulled by 3 horses. And this beautiful wintry scene is one of the most common that you find on boxes. And if you really, one of the first things that come to mind when you think Russia is Russian winter. Here is another nesting doll. He tells a story of kind of the evils of the bourgeoisie lifestyle. This is a very rotund gentleman filled with a feast. His buttons are straining at his waistcoat, and he's really meant to be a caricature of the noble families. There was a great need for new heroes in the Soviet era. And with St. George gone, came the advent of a literary hero, Malchish Kibalchish. He was a young boy who fought off the evil German army, was captured, and tortured. They tortured him and then bribed him and then tortured him, trying to get this great military secret that he held. He stuck to his convictions to the very end. The Red Army came, destroyed the Germans and saved the town. But in the story, Kibolchich dies. Now he becomes this revered hero, literary hero rather. But I just want to point out the similarities. He's riding this white horse. He doesn't have a flowing cloak, but the way he's holding his sword and leading forward harkens to St. George and the dragon. And that was his purpose, was to kind of supplant. Here's a small toy of Melchich Kibolchich. You can see he's a small boy wearing a uniform that's much too large for him. Sorry about that. And here is a Christmas ornament. Now, in the 1930s, the Soviets who had banned Christmas brought it back in a new light. It became the New Year's celebration. And so Soviet Russians could set up a New Year's tree and decorate it with patriotic and fun ornaments, including Melchich Kibolchich. And it was a time to kind of be grateful for the successes of the year and to be hopeful for successes of coming years. Another new hero became Yuri Gagarin, who was the first man in space. The space race affected Russian culture just as it did American culture, kind of infecting every aspect of life and showing up everywhere. To children's toys, to government-produced propaganda, to popular television shows. And here's Yuri Gagarin looking very much like St. Nicholas. He's standing there, proud and tall. He's holding up, rather than holding up a sword, he's waving hello. And rather than a gospel, he's holding a science book. Behind him are God, he's to space, and there's no God there. The churches at the bottom, there's actually a Christian church, a Muslim church, and the Orthodox church front and center, but they're all kind of tilting and falling over. And there he is as a Christmas ornament. And I want to point out that once you've seen it, you've seen the Yuri Gagarin and what he looks like, he becomes very recognizable. The artists have very stylized cosmonaut suits, which tells you who you're looking at. And those bright blue eyes kind of settles it down on which cosmonaut you're looking at. And cosmonaut nesting dolls. These were made in Belarus, which at the time was part of the Soviet Union, of course. They produced, I think, the widest variety of nesting dolls. They had kind of every popular subject you can imagine. And instead of focusing on making very artistic dolls, they made kind of very child-friendly dolls that were easy to handle, dolls that were hard wearing. And you can see it's very shiny with multiple layers of lacquer to protect the paint. Now, Morozko, who I mentioned when I talked about Olga, becomes a hero of winter. He takes over for St. Nicholas and Santa Claus and is important in Russia to this day. He was the god of winter, and now he is a mythical figure who lives in the Russian north and comes and brings gifts to children. And he is aided by his friend, the Snow Maiden, who was crafted out of snow by an elderly couple, and he breathed life into her. And she later came to live with him. And they are very popular figures at Christmas time.
Question?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You said this was kind of to replace religious figures or figures associated with Christianity. Is that right?
Yes.
And so are these also traditional figures like in folklore, etc., or were they kind of created?
So these two were traditional figures in folklore, but they rose in prominence. And in fact, I'll bring them up here. it was very common to show him looking kind of like Father Christmas or Santa Claus with a red cloak, but Stalin actually issued a decree claiming that he should be shown in a blue cloak to separate him from, you know, the evil Santa Claus of the West and the, you know, the dangers of remembering Saint Nicholas. It didn't quite take on because people were very, I think, fond of the red cloaked Grandfather Frost. But they did predate the Soviet Union, but were absolutely utilized by them. I should note that the Soviet economy, all artists worked for the state, and all factories were run by the state. And so the state kind of decreed what ornaments were available for people's toys and what trees and what toys were available to purchase for your children. And if you wanted to be a successful artist in the Soviet Union, you had to make art that reflected Soviet ideals. It's why so many artists, especially in the 1970s and 80s, left Russia, chose to leave rather than stay, because they couldn't make art that spoke to them and be profitable. Here is a much more Stalin approved Grandfather Frost. He has a white cloak. This is a paper mache sculpture. It was very common to have sculptures of Grandfather Frost or the Snow Maiden under your tree. And here's a beautiful blue Grandfather Frost. Also celebrated in the boxes and folk crafts are other older Russian customs that, again, kind of predated the Soviets and even predated Christianity, and were really kind of being put front and forth into a focal point. This is the presentation of bread and salt, which you find throughout Slavic cultures, very strong in Ukraine as well. And when you go to somebody's home, typically the eldest daughter would present a very beautifully woven bread on a embroidered towel with a little bowl of salt. The bread and salt is also featured at important ceremonies, weddings, and funerals. And again, I want to point out the kind of the romanticization of winter in Russia. So here we have the last leaf. If you look closely, within the leaf is fall. You can see a scene of the harvest. You can see the golden trees, and everything outside the leaf is winter. Here's a doll celebrating winter. Another troika image of warm winter evening. And the troika is very much present throughout Russian literature. Lots of poems about, you know, riding to enjoy the weather, to enjoy the snow, the landscape, to go to people's homes. And then Russian folk tales and fairy tales had their place on boxes and dolls as well. This is the tale of the giant turnip, which a man goes to pluck a turnip from the garden. He can't get it up. He calls his wife. They call the granddaughter, the dog, the cat, and the mouse, and they finally pull up a turnip as big as a house. Here's Ivan Tsarevich, the Firebird and the Great Wolf, which is it's a very long and beautiful fairy tale that you find in Russia about a prince, well, about a commoner who rescues a princess and becomes a prince himself with the aid of a magical bird.
Laura, can I ask a question? With the
Yep.
nesting? You mentioned that those were popular for tourists and so forth. Were they also items that people would have in their homes, and did children play with them?
Oh yes, absolutely. You know, these would be popular toys for children. In fact, there was an article produced in the 1950s in Russia, really touting how they had dolls that taught mathematics and spatial recognition, and introduced these concepts to their children. whereas American girls were playing with Barbies and learning consumerism.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So they were meant for not just for the kind of export, although that was a huge part of them, but especially the ones, you know, sold within the borders of the Soviet Union, did kind of celebrate Russian culture and, of course, all of the ideals that would have been important. So here's a lacquer box telling that same story of Ivan Tsarevich. And this box, which has my favorite Russian fairy tale, Tale of the Golden Fish. It's a fisherman who pulls up a golden fish in his net. He's elderly, and he and his wife live in a small hut by the lake, but he makes just as much as he needs from fishing to live reasonably well. The fish asks for his life and offers a wish, and he wishes for a better net so he can catch more fish. And the fish grants it, but his wife is furious and demands that he go back and ask for more. And this happens so on and so forth until he eventually wishes for her to be Tsarina, and she casts him out, and he goes back, and the fish takes pity on him and takes back all the wishes except for the net. And he and his wife learn to be very happy in their lives, living in a hut by the lake, but now catching more fish and living comfortably into their old age. Here's a more complicated box of the golden fish. This has multiple scenes. It has the man at the beginning kind of astonished finding the fish. It shows his wife as the Tsarina in the center and him being turned out. And then his wife sitting in actually a cave by the lake, but looking very glum about it all. And that ends my official talk. But if anybody has any questions, if there are any images you'd like me to go back to, now would be the time.
That was wonderful, Laura. Thank you so much. Fascinating. It just makes me wanting to know more, truly. And you have a program that you do on the Russian nesting, on the dolls too?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Did you say that you had a program on the nesting dolls specifically?
Oh, yes. Toys, trinkets, and treasures. And I explored just the history of the nesting dolls.
Amazing. We do have a question here from the chat. One person is asking, when is the museum open and what are your COVID protocols?
Oh, good questions. So the museum is open Thursday through Sunday from 10 to 4. We do ask people wear masks while they're in the museum. And we have followed all CDC guidelines on cleaning procedures, and we've been really lucky so far. But yeah, we just ask you wear a mask when you come. And how does Pasenki fit in? That is a really good question. So Pasenki, for those who don't know it, is it's more of a Ukrainian custom, but you do find it throughout the Slavic region, and it's decorative eggs, and it stems from Lent. During Lent, in the Orthodox faith, you can't eat meat, but you also can't eat any products of meat. So you cannot eat eggs, you cannot drink milk, but the chickens continue to lay eggs. And what are you going to do with a bunch of eggs? And so it became customary to paint the eggs. So some people blow the egg out, some boil the egg, but then you use a method of wax and dye. And so you put wax down wherever you want it to be white on the egg, and then you dip it into a lighter color, and then you put wax down on say it's yellow, and then another color that's darker, so on and so forth. That is an enormously complex art form that I couldn't even hope to give credit to without imagery, but it has beautiful storytelling within the egg, with a number of symbols being used representing long life, health, protection, guardianship. Interestingly, in Pasenki, figures like snakes and spiders have very positive meanings to them. We did have a beautiful display on Pasenki a year and a half ago, and that was a beautiful artist who made the eggs and also paintings inspired by the eggs. But that's down now. It didn't fit too much into Soviet kind of powerhouses of creating objects, but it did fit in. It was made, it still is made, but I think less as a tourist craft. Someone says, took me forever when I was a child. We used to have workshops, and I'm hoping as you know, if this pandemic ever ends, that we can go back to doing it. But every Easter we'd have a Pasenki workshop where people could come in and actually do it, and it's a lot of fun.
That's so cool. I have a question kind of generally. During the Soviet era, I really just don't know much about this, but it sounds like, at least in some ways and cases, arts were encouraged, at least to serve the state. And would you say that there was an upsurge in architect production during the Soviet era, or a downtick, or was it kind of a mixed thing?
There was definitely an upsurge. There was a lot of, you know, I don't want to say that there were a lot of positive ideals in the Soviet era. There was ideals that art was very important. It's extremely important to a culture, and it was wonderful that the government wanted to support art. Artists were, you know, offered education and training. There were guilds and artels, and you were given housing and stipends and everything you needed to live, as long as you produced art that was approved by the state. And that's where the ideals went awry, because it corrupted. Other ideals were education. Education became extremely important, and every child was to receive equal access to education. Women were to be promoted in the fields, and in fact, you know, some might say the reason they did so well in the space race is because their women were out and in the open. Other Soviet ideals were racial equality. Many of their propaganda posters throughout the Cold War pointed to American hypocrisy and American racism, and they attempted to show how non-racist they were. But of course, anti-Semitism especially was rampant throughout Soviet Russia, and you know, is still something that's a problem today. But the ideals were there. Arts and sciences and good lives for workers were the ideals.
Great. Does anyone have any more questions for Laura? If you do, pop them in the chat now. Laura, I actually heard a podcast, maybe it was a radio program, about anti-racism in Soviet Russia and Black people from America who moved to Russia for a better life, a better experience, which was a mixed bag, but it was a fascinating piece of history.
What was the podcast?
I'll see if I can find it. If I do, I'll send it to you.
That's very interesting.
It was totally interesting. It might have been a This American Life, actually.
Oh, okay.
Sure. But I'll see if I can find it. I don't see any more questions. Do you have anything else for us, Laura?
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed this. If you're able to come to the museum, and you know, send word at the front desk that you attended, and I'd be delighted to come out and say hello and meet you in person. And well, we have a terrific exhibit right now on contemporary Orthodox iconography from around the world. That's up through March, and it's absolutely worth seeing.
Wonderful. We were recording this program, so if everything goes smoothly, I'll be able to get it up on YouTube at some point privately and then share it out to everyone. I know a couple people missed the very beginning of the talk. Thank you again, Laura. This was really wonderful. Really
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
our pleasure. I hope to do it again.